This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. This year's World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos is the first in-person gathering since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what's on the agenda? How can the meeting help to deal with the global challenges we are now facing? And as the most important and the largest trade body in China, or China Council for the Promotion of International Trade, marks its 70th anniversary, we'll also take a look at China's growing role in global trade. To discuss these issues, I'm glad to be joined today by Wang Dan, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, China, David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management, and Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, welcome to the show. Let's start with this Davos meeting. And the theme of this year is, history at a turning point, government policies and business strategies. Wang Dan, I will start with you. What kind of a turning point we are talking about?
The world is undergoing quite a deep transition. We have seen a lot of the global problems, including the inflation, energy crisis, the war going on in Ukraine. And the government are, in fact, a part of the problem. The geopolitical tensions need the government to play a critical role. The inflation will need more of action and sometimes a coordination between different countries to tackle it. But so far, we haven't seen this kind of action. The world has turned more protectionist and inward. The business communities are trying to solve the problem, but they also need to deal with a lot of disruptions in the supply chain and also the uncertainties in the political world. So it is getting trickier for anyone who are trying to make a difference in this world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, what do you see as this turning point? What kind of turning point? Are we turning better or turning probably worse than the previous 10 years or 20 years?
Well, I think it's both, Qingduo. I agree with what Wang Dan just said, but I think it's even deeper than this. And the turning point is that we all have lived in somewhat of a fantasy world for the last several decades, where we believed that we transcended history. And what we've seen is that plague, war, and famine really are a part of the human condition. And in a way, history has bitten us back and reasserted itself. And I think this is the key turning point that we are faced with today. And I think the other point is that government versus business, which is one of the themes of Davos, or government and business, I should say, is one of the themes. And to paraphrase Tolstoy, while you may not be interested in government, government is interested in you, meaning that these enduring human challenges of pandemics, war, and I think hopefully not, but even famine, as we have heard some warnings about, really do require the actions of government, and government can be a very powerful force for both good and ill. And I think this is a very correct focus for Davos this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, the IMF has said that global economy is facing its biggest test since World War II. So, what do you see are the problems facing the global economy?
I think it's an overestimation on the part of the IMF. Truly, at the moment, the pressures are huge on all economies and governments. But the real crisis is for the West and Western economies. Because if you look at the Asian economies, and particularly China's, as things have become more difficult, and I take the last 2 years, China's performed very well. I mean, China was half of world trade last year. It was all of world trade in 2020. And it's going to return to its norm, which is 30% of world trade this year and next year. And even with all the COVID restrictions, the dynamic of the Chinese economy and its domestic engine is a very special story. So I think the crisis is for Western norms and assumptions of Western dominance. And so we're going to see a different world, that's true. But is it a worse world? Well, at the moment for Europeans and for Western people, the invasion of Ukraine is a particularly stressful point. But what if you were living in the Middle East when America invaded Iraq? Or there was the debacle in Afghanistan? You know, although it didn't have the same economic impact, it depends where you are in the world at what time. And I think China's weathering things pretty well. This year's uncertain, and there'll be some big growth issues because of COVID responses, but these are short-term issues. The underlying fundamentals of the Chinese economy are good. And so, as it has been in the global financial crisis, in the Asian financial crisis, China will be the engine that helps pull the world out of its current doldrums. It may take 18 months, but I think that'll be what will happen. So I'm a bit more optimistic.
Good to know that you are optimistic about the future, the prospect of China economy and the global economy. So Andy, I think this is an interesting point. It probably depends on where you are, depends on which part of the global economy you are talking about. Their performance could be different.
No, that's absolutely true, Xingduo. And I think one very important development that has been overlooked, understandably, with all of the crises, I would say even the catastrophes that we're facing, both geopolitical and economic, is, I think, cause for optimism regarding China. And that is the announcement by the Chinese government of the development of a national unified market, which I think David is spot on in saying that this will be an important contributor to China being the engine of economic recovery and perhaps an anchor of stability politically as well. Because as we know, China, with its enormous population of 1.4 billion people, is a big market, but it's not necessarily yet a strong market. So if the National Unified Market Policy is successful, as it's expected to be, this really will play a very positive force in putting China on a sustainable development path and serving as the engine, as David said, for powering global growth for years to come.
Well, one day, if you look at the global economic recovery, I think people probably find it more a bit pessimistic. For example, earlier this year, the World Economic Forum, they released a report. Basically, only 11% of these global experts feel optimistic about its acceleration of global economic recovery. What do you see about this economic recovery from the developed world as well as the developing world?
And there are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about the world, where the world is right now. It's not just the food crisis, the energy crisis, there's also inaction from a lot of the governments. And people, especially politicians, tend to blame certain institutions for their problems, but actually everybody knows it needs deeper reform rather than just short-term macroeconomic policy to resolve those issues. And I'm somewhat between a conservative optimism and somewhat getting used to it. It is the situation always that people tend to be more pessimistic when we're going through this transition. We have broken a lot of the old norms, and the new norm is under this rebuilding process, especially the climate change initiatives. I do have high hopes in that.
Well, you talked about the importance of government reform. Can you go into detail about what kind of reforms you think that's necessary, probably, for the global governance?
Well, some of the reform lie in the government's approach to domestic economies, because when we talk about the most important issue, like climate change, it needs a lot of the state backing, capital, and state policies to ensure the success of a lot of the climate-related industrial changes. And then when it comes to the policy coordinations, we have seen that the Federal Reserve, for example, trying to hike rates very aggressively in the recent month, and probably in the coming month as well. But they have been really lagging in coming out of the effective policy when the inflation has already taken off. So the global economy needs better coordination in their macro response. And that requires a lot of communication between different governments, different central banks, and that is clearly lacking right now.
Andy, obviously the geopolitics is also one of the major factors affecting this global economic performance. For example, there is a force, you can also call it like an anti-globalization force, probably in particular in Western countries. For example, because of the Ukraine war, you do see this disintegration or this collapse of relationship between Russia and the U.S., Russia and the West in general. And now we are seeing, President Biden is unveiling this economic framework of the Indo-Pacific. So you do see we are not rebuilding globalization. We are building different camps or different groupings, even against a particular economy, like as important as China. So how that probably will affect the globalization, free trade, or global economic performance?
Well, Tingdo, I think that the structural elements are in place for a very optimistic outlook. So I mentioned that China's national unified market. The other major development for this year is the formal inauguration of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So if nothing disrupts this, I think we're on a very, very good track. And as Asia Pacific grows, becomes the economic center of gravity even more than it is today, these problems will take care of themselves. But, and here's a very important but, we are in an incredibly dangerous time, I think over the next 12 months to perhaps 3 years. And that is exactly because of the reasons you raised, in that we look at the conflict in the Ukraine. And this still, even though it seems like the perceived risk has gone down, that this could be a catastrophic conflict with the potential use of nuclear weapons. We look at Biden's recent statement that has been interpreted as a change in US policy, a change in the one China policy. These could lead to catastrophic outcomes, including nuclear warfare. So I think economics, of course, the economic questions are very important, but we are still in an incredibly dangerous time. And I think what governments do, and in particular, what the West and the US does, will be very, very important over the next couple of years. Briefly on the economic side as well, I think that this has been an incredibly damaging time for the international system, because the US is not only one of the most important players in the global economic arena, but because of the US dollar, its central role as a reserve currency, the financial system that the world must rely on is controlled by the United States. The US's actions in its war against Russia really have undermined trust in the international system. And I think this is also a very, very difficult challenge that makes the short term very, very dangerous.
One Dan, economist, do you also see this geopolitical factor, which is playing probably an active role in terms of global economic development when it comes to the relationship between Washington, Beijing, Washington, and Moscow, for example?
It absolutely has significant impact on global trade and economic development and their long-term strategies. So when business decides where to invest, for example, they now would increase the weight of political factor and geopolitical factor by a great deal, which was never the case in the past 20 years. So when you think about these factors, that means for certain markets, it no longer is investable. Now it's Russia. It might be extended to other regions in the world. And that can cause pretty significant disruption to the supply chain. The immediate implication would be that a lot of the companies would want to create parallel production lines, and that's a big waste of investment in terms of productivity. And for some regions like China, we have probably the most resilient and the most complete industrial chains in the world. But due to political consideration, some companies might consider to get some of the production lines out of China to ASEAN, to Mexico, or even back to the US. So globally, I see this as a backward force to the economic development and also to the poverty reduction for a lot of developing countries.
More or less on that line, Andy, you do see this food crisis, for example, partly not exactly because of this, Ukraine war over there, but it definitely has an knock-on effects on this food crisis. For example, part of the say the wheat from Ukraine cannot be transported out of that region, or the Russian wheat you cannot be shopped or traded in the international market because of the sanctions. So you do see these geopolitical factors, playing a prominent role in terms of the economy, in terms of this food crisis. But to seek the solution to that, plus it's a climate factor, what do we need to do? In particular, the important global economies like China, like Russia, like the United States, European Union, India. Is there anything they can work together probably to reduce this problem in developing world?
Well, Tingdu, I think first of all, this emerging food crisis is also linked to energy as well, because energy is used to create fertilizer, and Russia and Belarus are two of the largest suppliers of fertilizer to the global market, which affects countries like Brazil and Argentina that are major soybean producers. So we can see that this is a very, very important problem. How do we solve it? I think, unfortunately, again, it comes back to geopolitics, because we are in, as President Xi has said, changes unseen in a century, that we are in a period of flux, in a period of transition. And if we can come through it without any sort of major kinetic conflict, any sort of man-made catastrophe, I think we are on track for a much more stable and prosperous future. The way to get there, perhaps, then, is really, I think, every country working together in good faith and relying on international institutions as well, like the United Nations, other organizations, to successfully address some of these challenges.
Well, David, as we said, this year marks this 70th anniversary of this most important trade body in China, the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade. You have been in China for many, many years. So what's your opposition of the China's trade, increasing, I would say, share of China's trade in terms of global trade, and also probably more active participation for China to participate in this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, Dora, it's a very important landmark. I think that the issue is, when you talk of China or any perspective, it can't be in comparison to other economies too much. And I came to China in 1984, so I always compared China to itself and its own growth. And the one thing that really has surprised me or impressed me is that China, for periods of the 90s, was trade dependent. It helped China in partnership largely with the US, but also the West, to come out of its shared and poverty and backwardness. What then China achieved was a very strong domestic market. And so now trade itself, particularly exports, are no longer so critical to the Commonwealth of China or its development. China is its own engine in a unique way. No other country in the world is its own engine. So in that sense, China's become a lot more independent. But at the same time, it is crucial for it to remain a core to global economic development and growth, because it needs markets to sell into to some degree, but it needs to secure the things it doesn't have. And those are many, whether they're technology, components, whether it's oil, proteins, Andy mentioned food crisis. I don't think whatever we do, we're going to avoid a food crisis in the next 18 months. And I mean real famines in North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I think we're going to see food inflation in the West. China's okay because it has reserves. It's got huge grain reserves, and I think it will manage that because the government plays a greater role in business. But ultimately, we're in a world where countries are in relative conflict. I don't see the Russian invasion of Ukraine as something other than Western democracies or Western systems. I see that the West is in decline. Russia is a Western country, and this is an aspect or a signature of its decline. As we've seen, America's failure in its wars have been its decline. So, America was a catalyst to this war. We all know that to some degree. So I think it's about weathering these periods. And he also mentioned nuclear conflict. Russia's not going to use nuclear weapons on itself, which effectively would mean if it tried to do something in the Ukraine. And I think Taiwan is overblown. Nothing's changed. Biden just reiterated the Taiwan Relations Act and one clause in it. There's no new policy here. The status quo will remain. America has an interest in utilizing Taiwan as a tool, but in real terms, it doesn't want to get embroiled in a war with China. And China, too, is too smart to be reactionary in this. So in cycles, we get told Taiwan's the flashpoint. It never is. And I don't think that it will be. I think in the next 3 years, we may be having another conversation and someone else may have fabricated something related to the Taiwan-China issue. I think the real things are weathering these next few years and making good decisions and not overreacting. But those who will suffer outside of these major economies, we can't change that. I'm afraid it's going to be a very rough ride for some smaller developing countries.
Andy, what's your take on that?
Well, I think David makes some great points. Regarding China's trading relationship with the world, I think we're moving into a new era because originally China's economic success was built on exporting relatively high labor, relatively low value goods. And I think we're seeing now China moving, of course, has already moved up the value chain, but moving up in less visible ways. So we've seen companies like Huawei become global technology champions. We see companies like Douyin, TikTok winning around the world. And these are very visible. But what's less visible are things like Ant Plus. So this is Ant Financial's global financial network that allows individuals and small businesses around the world to use their local payment system or their local wallet, but to transact, to buy things in China, to buy things in Africa, to buy things in Europe, transparently and friction-free. So I think there still is room for greater engagement, greater trade, cross-border investment, and even cross-border labor flows. I think once we come to terms with the COVID pandemic, that again, if we can get past this turbulent period driven by geopolitics, the structural elements are in place, I think, for a very bright future.
Well, Wang Dan, for China, obviously, as China is moving up the value chain, you do see more competition or friction sometimes with countries like the United States because it's more competitive. And then there is, China is also widening its market access, basically. For example, every year there is a Shanghai Import Expo. China is trying to import more stuff from other countries. So hopefully that will help, strengthen the relationship between China and the rest of the world. So what's the prospect, on that two frontier, let's say, both import and export, and also high value these products and services?
China has never really changed its openness attitude in terms of trade, in terms of investment. But now when we look at China's trade strategy or its position in global trade, it is a great strength for China, but also one source of vulnerability. After the trade war with the US in 2016, and now essentially we're looking at a high-tech sector that are in effect decoupled between the two countries. It has caused great pain for domestic supply chains, especially in the high-tech sector, in electronics. So China had to rely on itself. That's why we saw this kind of stress over indigenous innovation and tons of state money backing research and development. And this has shown how difficult it is when it comes to the competition for transformative technology for the future. And for China, of course, it has to maintain its supply chain strength. It wants to climb up the supply chain for sure, but also the international environment targeting China would become more hostile, I'm afraid, unless the global economy, especially the Western countries, can see China as a great market, as a potential place they can also make money. So China has been reducing the length of its negative list. it has been more open than before. Currently, the COVID episode has caused a lot of the loss in confidence for foreign investors. But I do think this is a transient period. Once this is over, we'll see the same kind of attitudes towards foreign investors and global trade. And by then, foreign investors should have a new evaluation and prospect on China's future growth.
Well, Andy, obviously China is also, China is part of the RCEP, as you mentioned, RCEP, this Regional Comprehensive Economic Framework, the partnership. China is also applying to join this CPTPP, previously known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's people would say that's Mao high standard, the trade agreement. So, and also China is continuing with this One Belt, One Road initiative over there. What do you see this potential, for China to become more, say, open and also trying to play a bigger role and with probably high standard in terms of openness and reforms domestically, as well as investment overseas under this BRI?
No, I think that absolutely is the direction. And this has been consistent, as Wang Dan has said, for years, if not decades. So what we're seeing is, again, this deepening of structural reform through the national unified market, which will reduce protectionism, local protectionism, therefore making it easier for both domestic companies and foreign companies to sell into a much larger and still growing market. So as the phrase goes, making China's market not just big, but also strong. I think another very important unifying force to tie China closer to the global system is also the rollout of China's digital currency, the digital yuan. That also can be revolutionary in terms of making trade investment easier, cheaper, safer, and may even address some of the long-held challenges about greater capital account convertibility for the Chinese yuan. So I think, again, there's lots of reasons for optimism. And we also shouldn't forget that what made America, the United States, so influential was not only its military, but arguably more, and the dollar. But perhaps most importantly, the size of its market and the openness of its market. And we see now the US moving in a somewhat different direction, being less willing to provide market access to not only countries like China, but even its erstwhile or ostensible allies like Germany and like Japan. Whereas China is taking the opposite tact and moving to open its market and make it more accessible, not just to the global corporations, but SMEs all around the world. So I think, again, there is room for optimism, but there are challenges in the short term that we really should not underestimate.
Well, on that note, we are concluding today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qin Duo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.